8th Rulemaking Advisory Committee meeting for the Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities Rulemaking effort. So thank you all so much for being here today and spending the next 3 hours with us. Again, I'm Sylvia Chibrowski, helping to facilitate these meetings. And I will turn it over to Commissioner Lilac to give us some welcoming remarks, and then I'll go over the agenda. So over to you.
Thanks, Sylvia. It's great to be here. It's great to see everyone. Thank you for being here. A couple of months ago, we really pivoted to the rulemaking. And as Sylvia mentioned, as we were just coming online here this morning, we are really in the thick of it now. It started at our meeting last month, today, and in the meetings ahead. And you'll hear more about our schedule ahead from going from 3 to 4 hour meetings and additional meetings. And there's just so much incredibly important work to do. You are instrumental to absolutely all of it. And so thank you so much for being here. I think one of the keys beginning today and through the rest of the process is we're already receiving a lot of really great comments from members of the RAC, from members of the public and communities and organizations, and it's really terrific. And we encourage it all through the process. I've had some people ask me now, who've just seen the rules, reviewed the rules for the first time, and asked how close we are to being finished. And I'm sharing with everybody, we're really now at the beginning of the process of going through the draft rules, and public involvement is going to be instrumental in drafting those final rules. So we look forward to any and all of your comments today in writing and follow-ups in subsequent meetings, including at the commission meeting next week. And what we ask is that you please be specific in providing solutions if there are criticisms or issues to address, or certain rules may not appear to be connected for one reason or another. Please think about it and think about how we might improve that rule or the standard or the timeline, whatever it may be. We really are looking for solutions as we work together to draft the final rules. Huge agenda this morning. I'm sorry, I have a conflict this morning. This is going to be the only meeting that I miss. I will watch it. I'm so glad that they're recorded and available online, so I will do that. And then I'll look forward to participating in all of our subsequent meetings. So with that, I will just mention that our chair, Robin MacArthur, is here, and she's observing this morning. And with that, Sylvia, I will turn it back to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Commissioner. I'll go through our agenda and then we can dive in today. So as the Commissioner said, really today we are getting into the rules. We really spent the first half of the rulemaking kind of talking at that concept level and getting your ideas, and DLCD has packaged that into draft rules. And this really is the time to talk about the details and if something's not working, why, and what's the solution to make it better. So that's really the overall focus for today with the rules. And for our agenda topics, after our kind of welcome opening, the team will review the schedule for rulemaking, which has changed a bit, longer meetings. So kind of make sure you're all oriented to that. And then we will talk about how the draft rules seek to advance equity. So Evan will provide some context there, and really looking to hear from you, your questions and thoughts there. We don't have a ton of time for that agenda topic, so we'll also be able to take some comments offline for that piece. And then one of our major topics for the day is going through the rules for high quality pedestrian, bicycle, and transit improvements. So there, Bill will walk through those rules. And then we'll have breakout sessions with the RAC members and really talking through, do these rules meet the climate friendly and equitable goals? Is this what you want the rules to look like on the ground? And then after a quick break, we'll get into discussion on draft rules for vehicle miles traveled reduction targets. And there again, Cody will provide some context, and we'll have time for a little bit of discussion with the RAC in the full group. And then we'll end with our next steps. So a pretty full agenda. And, as always, we had the discussion here in the room, but always encourage your comments offline as well through the surveys after these meetings. I'll just go through a few of our logistics and process reminders, and then we'll get into the meeting. So just a reminder, we appreciate you all being here, and we really want to have the conversation in the in the room. So we'll just use the chat for troubleshooting, meeting management, but not for any substantive comments. And you're always, of course, encouraged to provide more substantive comments by email. The meeting is being recorded, as you know, and will be posted on the DLCD rulemaking webpage after the meeting. And members of the public are welcome to submit written comments to the DLCD email address. And when we get into our discussion periods, we'll just encourage you to raise your hand to get in the queue to speak. And if you're joined by phone only, you can press *9 to do that. And I think that's it for sort of our main process reminders. With that, I think I'm just going to turn it over to Bill and Kevin to go through the rulemaking schedule.
There we go. Thank you, Sylvia. Bill Holmstrom, DLCD staff, and I'm here with Kevin Young, and we're going to go over just a few things having to do with where we're heading here in the next few months. So, rulemaking schedule, and there's a version of this with the more detail that's in your packet. So I believe that's item 3 in your packet if you want to follow along. But this is just a real quick overview of where we're looking at. So, like Commissioner Lilac said, after this meeting today, our commission will be meeting and having an update from staff next week. It's next Thursday. I believe just afternoon is what we're tentatively scheduled for, though sometimes the commission moves things around a little bit. But go ahead and you look on the agency's website. You can click on the commission and find more information about their agenda. They're going to be hearing kind of updated where we are overall, big picture, and then and Kevin can talk about this a little bit more if people have questions. But a lot of good comments and questions came from the advisory committee and from local governments in particular about climate-friendly areas after our last meeting. And I think we are interested in hearing what the commission has to say on a few key questions. And if you're interested to hear what those are in the packet that went to the commission, and that's available on our website. Obviously, anyone is welcome to watch that meeting. It's going to be available online for viewing. And if folks want to testify, there's information on the commission's website about how to sign up to testify if that's what you're interested in doing. And next month in October, we've as I think we've decided a couple months ago, we were going to have another meeting, and I apologize. The packet's a little bit inconsistent about what it calls this meeting. We're calling it RAC 8.5. It's 8.5, which is kind of weird, but it kind of made sense at the time. But I think in a couple of places we do say it's RAC 9. RAC 9 is happening in November. But the RAC that's happening in October is 8.5, and we're going to be ideally we'll have all parts of the rules that we intend to have out there will be out there in draft form in October. We will have including rules that you haven't seen yet about transportation performance standards or mobility standards and how those work, how we plan to update those, which is something that was in the commission's charge, and we've talked about a couple months ago and what the concept was for that. We'll also have draft rules for street and highway planning, which kind of fit with along some of the other modal planning we'll be talking about today about bicycles, pedestrian and transit planning. So we just want to make sure that we're planning for all the different systems. And so those will be coming next month, as well as maybe a few other little bits and pieces. Late in October, we'll have a set of community conversations. If folks remember, back in the spring, we held a set of community conversations. We'll have 4 of them again this time. Information is on our website, and I believe, Ingrid, we will be sending out information to the advisory committee with the specific dates and times of each of those. We have a geographic location attached to each of those, but it doesn't really matter since it's all on Zoom anyway. And last time we had a lot of people kind of going back and forth between them depending on when they could make it. So we have a couple of daytime ones and a couple evening ones just to give people an opportunity at different times. And those are open, obviously, to decision makers, members of the public, anyone that wants to attend on those. In November, that is our final scheduled advisory committee meeting. We'll have a final review of the rules and review impact statement, which is what's required by law in order before we adopt the rules that the advisory committee review impact statements, and we'll go through that process of doing that. It says final rules review, but the rules aren't going to be final until they're actually adopted by the commission, which is scheduled for March right now. So there will still be opportunities after that advisory committee to make changes, and we expect to make changes on a continuing basis based on advisory committee meeting in November. Later on in November, we'll go back to the commission, go over those rules with them, and get direction on if there's any key questions that have come up through our conversations to make sure that we're going in the direction that the commission wants. And December is mostly going to be administrative work, working through our attorneys at the Department of Justice and making sure that we're on path to have it published by the Secretary of State in January. I just want to be real clear with people. Just because we have that those draft rules published doesn't mean we still can't and will probably make changes to them. The commission is going to have a first hearing on the rules in January or potentially early February, whenever that meeting happens with the commission. It's either late January or early February. And once we have those dates nailed down, we'll make sure to let everyone know. And after that hearing, we expect that there will probably be some changes that will need to happen. And then the final hearing and adoption will happen in March of 2022. So I don't know, Kevin, did you have some other things you wanted to talk about?
I think that's great, Bill. Good overview. I guess we can respond to questions as if people have questions about that or other items.
Yeah, that's great. So any questions from folks? Kirsten.
Real quick, I just so appreciate Bill's overview. It's great. Kirsten Green, the Deputy Director here, just supporting the team's effort. And just wanted to clarify that at commission meetings, until we're actually in hearings, we would use the term public comment. Don't feel that you have to testify at this juncture, but we're still in the process of shaping those rules as Bill described. So please come, feel free to testify, small t, but do know that things are still work in progress, and we do appreciate your engagement and guidance. Thanks, Sylvia.
Thanks,
Bill,
Kirsten.
I did think of one thing that we should mention, which is, I think one of the issues that has been raised based on the draft that went out is the applicability of rules to the Portland metropolitan region. I just want to let folks know that we are engaged with local governments and with Metro, working through how these rules may apply to the Metro region. As we've said throughout this rulemaking effort, we know that that region is much further along in implementing their 2040 growth concept. So that is an issue that we are continuing to work through. Hope to have a revised proposal for how that might work out in our October meeting materials.
Well, and Kevin, I'm going to make just a brief thought about that, and that's I want to frame it up this way in thinking about the question about Metro and applicability, and that is that every rulemaking I've been involved in over the years has had at least one point in the process where there's some sort of unexpected turn or things come up. And when we do the rulemaking process, we like to work it out that we start on a broad policy level and then we kind of work our way down to the detailed rule writing. But when it comes to the rule writing, we almost always find that there's some question that we missed or didn't get resolved at that broad level, and we need to kind of work back up. And so early on, as we were thinking at that broad level, we were really thinking a lot about the scenario planning. And in that case, it was very obvious to us that the cities and counties within Metro would not be doing this again. They've done a scenario planning process through Climate Smart, and that these rules would not be working on Metro. And so that was the way we thought about it, and we set up the Rulemaking Advisory Committee. But then as we get into writing the specific rules, as we started writing about rules about climate-friendly areas, the parking rules, how local transportation system plans are written, we realized it's actually not obvious that those rules wouldn't apply to cities and counties in Metro. And so that is, as Kevin said, we're going back and re-engaging then with the cities and counties within Metro and with Metro itself, and to talk about how these rules might apply there, because those were not included on the Rulemaking Advisory Committee initially, because we were thinking about the scenario planning rules primarily. And so that's not a question we're going to try to resolve today at the meeting, but it is something certainly we want to hear input and feedback from anybody on those kinds of issues here. But without having those members on the rack from the cities and counties within Metro and not having had the chance to do all that engagement with them, we don't want to try to resolve that today. That would be out of order.
Thank you, Matt and Kirsten. Here, Sylvia, just another quick PSA. If folks are curious about the scheduled discussions, they can certainly email the team. And Margie and I are coordinating. Margie, I have an email queued to send off to you about some scheduling. So please stay tuned for that if you're a city or county in the Portland metro area. Thank you.
All right, thank you for those updates. Any questions from RAC members? Yeah, Emma.
Less of a question and more of a comment. I'm just feeling as if there is a lot of material coming our way. I think there's a lot of support among RAC members for the outcomes of this process. And I think it'd be really unfortunate to see the rules adopted in a state that isn't actually well thought out and feasible for implementation due to such a crunch timeline in developing the rules. And then I also have concerns about the timeline for implementation. Like, I really want to set this process up for success. I recently met with our mayor and council leadership. They're supportive of the outcomes, but there's some pretty serious concerns about the implementation pieces and just the speediness of this process. Like, I'm still trying to digest this packet. I sent just the transit section to our transit experts over at the local transit district, which is one of the larger transit districts in the state. And the response I got was, whoa, this seems complex and complicated. I need more time to think it through and understand it. So I just hope that there would be the opportunity to really have the time to engage. I appreciate that DLT has responded by extending the next 2 meetings to 4 hours, but just extending existing scheduled meetings by another hour, I don't think is sufficient to actually get the good quality rules that I think everyone in our state wants to see. All of us are looking outside and being like, okay, it's been a red sun for 2 weeks. There's smoke everywhere. Clearly this is urgent and we need to have good quality rules. And I'm concerned that this timeline isn't going to get us there.
Yeah, Emma, thanks. Just checking if staff have any response.
I'll just note, for everyone's benefit. So the commission meets next week. Our Land Conservation Development Commission meets, and we'll provide an update on the CFEC work, the climate friendly, equitable communities work. A couple of questions that we heard loud and clear in comments on, particular on the climate friendly areas, were the timelines that are included there and the amount of flexibility allowed for development standards and CFAs and climate friendly areas. We're taking those questions to the commission. We're looking for some preliminary direction from the commission on that issue, on those issues, I should say. We're aware, we're trying to balance, the need to act urgently with getting it right. And so I think this input is really important. So thank you, Emma.
Thanks, Kevin. All right, and let's just take a couple more comments, questions, and then we can dive into the next topic. I know we want to leave plenty of time for substance too today to really get through the rules. So Cassie.
Yeah, I'm Cassie Lacey, City of Bend. I just want to echo similar sentiment to what Emma shared. We also really want to see this process succeed and certainly are aligned with the goals and objectives. But when we were hoping for, when we've shared that we need more time, I was expecting that to be more time to actually review the rules themselves. And so seeing that the more time is just in the format of 1 extra hour per meeting doesn't actually address kind of the concern we had around time for the review process. And we're having the same experience where sharing these rules out with staff, the decision has been made by certain departments that we just straight up don't have capacity to review them at all within the meeting times. And so it just doesn't, we don't feel like we're being, like we really have a good opportunity to review them and provide good feedback. And so there's that missed opportunity there. And so we were definitely hoping for some kind of, as far as adjusting the timeline, like actual more time to review them, not just more time to discuss them together, because we're just not set up where we can prepare for that effectively. So that's it for us.
Thanks, Cassie. And Mary Kyle?
Thank you. I agree, as Emma said, and that even with another hour added to a meeting, there's the density of the materials we receive is just really hard to go through. So I want to encourage, again, the use of subcommittees, like just one on the transit parts, one on the pedestrian parts, one on the bicycle parts, just to digest and come back to the full committee in between the larger meetings. And then secondly, I think as the staff thinks about how to present this to the commission and what you've heard about timelines, I'd again repeat something that was raised in the last meeting by several, is the idea of breaking it apart. Right now, it looks like once you designate a CFA, 75 more pages of regulations come with that to implement it, that those are joined, as opposed to separating out the big major things to do, like just map a CFA and spend some more time figuring out what it means in terms of the 75 more pages that come along with that, and spending more time on that detail. So the timelines still, anyway, just when you're thinking about timelines going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary Kyle. And Kari?
Thanks. Yeah, definitely wanted to just echo what others had said. And I think I'm feeling very uncomfortable with a 4-hour Zoom meeting. I think a 3-hour Zoom meeting is already pushing the envelope in terms of people's ability to focus and stay focused. And so I think my perspective is that we would not necessarily get more done with another hour on these meetings. And I think that's something that needs to be taken into consideration. I think also there is the issue of the packet and the size of the packet, and that is already a burden. I think especially for community partners who I don't have staff to send this out to do analysis on. I have to read through all of this myself. I barely read through it, let alone did any analysis of it. I don't have the capacity for that, and that's not a fair balance on this committee. So I think reconsidering, whether it's the timeline, I know we want to get these rules made and we want to get this going, and it's really urgent. It's incredibly urgent. We should have been doing this work years ago, but I think thinking about extending the work that we're doing, the amount of time that takes, and if that means having more meetings but shorter ones, having more packets but shorter ones, I think that would really actually benefit the process a lot. Thanks.
Thanks, Kari. And, I think these process pieces are really important, and we want to save a lot of time today for substance too. I just want to see DLCD, any thoughts on this, or anything you want to say, and then we can really move into the substance.
Kevin and Bill, Matt, this is Kirsten here again, supportive of the effort and help, liaise with the commission. You have your commission liaisons here, and Chair MacArthur it's really great that Chair is listening in today. She's hearing all this, so we're hearing you. We know it's intense, and we will discuss it as a team. Thank you for being clear in your comments.
Thanks, Kirsten. And we'll just, if you have any other thoughts on the process, just please go ahead and email those to the team. And it sounds like we're circling back. With that, let's go ahead and move into the rules, the CFC, the Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities rules, and how they seek to advance equity. So I'll turn it over to Evan, and really here we'll be highlighting the equity-related items of the rules, kind of how do they seek to center the voices of priority populations. And then we want to have a discussion with the group on what ideas do you have to center the voices of priority populations in decision-making. So Evan, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Next slide. Great. So Equity is a central part of these rules, from the title of the rulemaking itself, to who we've invited into the room. And we started with equity to guide us through these rules, and we really appreciate having that guide star of the equitable outcome statement. As we've gone through it, we realize that a lot of what we're going to be doing is not so much in the rule language itself, but in associated efforts. Today, we're going to be talking about what's in the rule, both kind of public engagement process and then some equitable impacts of some specific issue areas. But I do want to reiterate that a lot of our equity stuff is going to be in guidance, which is kind of the advice we give on people on how to implement these rules, things like model codes and technical assistance, grants, and that sort of thing. So the equity will be for years on in implementation. Some of this some of the bigger equity questions, I don't think we really have the authority for, like either the department or the commission don't have the statutory authority to do. That doesn't mean we don't need to think about it and think about how to get it done, but we can't force other folks to do legally. And some of it was just outside of the scope of the rulemaking. This is a huge rulemaking as it is, and we can't touch all threads. So we are continuing to partner with our state agency partners, thinking about how to bring in housing funding, thinking about where some of the DEQ funds are going, all sorts of different things, and bringing resources, because addressing equity will take resources. We're also doing an a state of Oregon-wide effort to look at how we map equity issues spatially and how that can inform various agencies' decisions. And outside of this rulemaking, I would want to say we are continuing equity work at the department. Hopefully, I know a lot of you joined us last week to talk about the anti-displacement toolkit, which our housing team led in partnership with PSU and Dr. Bates, which is great. And we're looking at changing our advisory committees and our grant making. All of those have new equity components relatively recently. So or strengthened equity components. And we do have an active DEI committee. So lots of different things going on, but let's get into that very first bullet now. Next slide. This was a question we had at the end of the last RAC, was saying, hey, we've been using the term priority populations, but that doesn't feel quite right. And we asked you for input. We got some feedback, and it lots of different opinions. We can all wordsmith, but there was some momentum towards those first two options. And underserved populations is something that's being used elsewhere in the state and elsewhere nationally. And that's what we're kind of proposing to use going forward. And I would say if that gives somebody a lot of heartache, please reach out to me and we can continue to reflect upon that. But that's kind of the direction that we're thinking we're going to be heading. Throughout these slides, we're still using priority populations because we don't feel that's final, but that's what we heard and where we think we'll head. Next slide. So the rules themselves, which you may have had a chance to look at in the packet or may not have. Rule 115 is about engagement, and it says communities have to center voices of priority populations during TSP updates and make a special effort to inform and engage them. And as much as possible, give them an equitable share of decision-making power over key decisions. Now, the extent possible is kind of bumping up against our statutory authority. We can't force people to change who's on their planning commission or their city council or county commission, whatever. But we do want to make sure that the people around the table are really reflecting priority populations, underserved populations. In Rule 120, we bring that definition of priority populations that you all helped develop in the equitable outcome statement into the rules. And so we list those communities, and we say people, as they're doing their planning, need to prioritize community-led decision-making and engagement with specific attention to priority populations. And the last bit of it is they have to identify concentrations of populations. So that's where our spatial equity mapping work will come in to assist local governments to do that. But we do want to know where those pockets are, so we can be aware of where our plans may impact. Next slide. Rule 125 is about decision making. And this is kind of saying local governments have to center the voices of priority populations. And here are some things that you can do that would indicate you're doing that sort of thing. Report on progress, do analyses. We'll get into that in the next slide. Do additional outreach. Make sure that outreach is very accessible in all the ways that you all identified in the equitable outcome statement. And really look at how the plans are going to impact priority populations. And then include that in the decision-making factors. Certainly tribal notification and consultation, if requested, is a key part and is required. And then report annually on how well you're doing at centering the voices of priority populations to the local government and to the department. Next slide. So the equity analysis that was previously mentioned. Oh, this is an old version of, okay. Sorry, okay. Still pretty much the same. Okay, so what we did when we looked at the City of Portland and City of Seattle's racial equity toolkits and some other things that our partners shared with us, is we found a process that we generally liked, which was saying, hey, when you're doing land use and transportation plans, you have to do an equity analysis. And that means pretty much starts with engaging people, as we did in this process, develop key outcomes together. So know what you're trying to get to, and then kind of figure out what's happened with past policies, and look at intersectionality, and then gather lived experience, qualitative, quantitative information about how the proposed policy might improve or burden priority populations. Try to align it all with key outcomes, develop strategies, implement it, monitor it, report back, continue the cycle of looking at what you're trying to get, engaging folks, doing the analysis, developing the policies, implementing, et cetera. So that's kind of the cycle of equity analysis and engagement that is written into the rules as something that communities have to do in developing land use and transportation plans. Next slide. So that all is the process that we have in there right now, and we love your input on how to improve that. Content-wise, besides the actual process, because process is key, and we heard that very strongly, and as we talked about equity and outcomes. But there are some specific things that we think will improve equity overall. First, the stuff we're talking about later today, walking, biking, transit, that has a strong equity thread. The parking reform, we've talked about how that has an equity thread. Scenario planning, really trying to make sure that as people do their scenario planning, there's an engagement plan that centers the priority communities. And we have shared equitable outcomes and track those actions. And then the spatial equity analysis we've talked about before. So those are all written into the rules right now as far as additional content. Next slide. Oh, Al, you raised your hand, sorry.
Yeah, just a quick question. Are there any examples of Seattle's spatial equity analyses that they have completed at this point that we could have a look at?
I believe so. I believe they developed it in 2013, but Cody or anyone else aware of that answer?
Yeah, they used it in some comprehensive plan amendments that they did. And so we can follow up with some information on specifically how they used it, if that'd be helpful.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Cody. All right, this one I'm going to turn to Kevin.
You bet. Yeah, I'll just note on that last question, we have been working with Steve Lee from the governor's office, who actually did quite a bit of the work for Seattle in developing that. So that's been super helpful. But to move into climate friendly areas, so there's a couple of key components in promoting equity in the designation of climate friendly areas. So all of the bullets here are based on the version of the rules that you saw in your last packet. So per those rules, all cities and urbanized county areas with population over 2,500 would be required to use public engagement and decision-making processes that Evans just outlined from rules 0115 through 0125. In addition, as the cities or local governments are designating climate-friendly areas, the rules require including plans for achieving fair and equitable housing outcomes within those climate-friendly areas. So that decision-making process is actually fleshed out in the housing rules and what that analysis entails. Most specifically, we're concerned about the potential for displacement of priority populations or underserved populations. And so there's a specific requirement for the analysis of the potential for displacement and identification of mitigation measures, if necessary, as part of the designation of climate-friendly areas. As we've been thinking it through, that really needs to be done at the time of designation, because once you've designated, sort of those impacts are kind of implied. And so we want that analysis to inform the designation of climate-friendly areas. Additionally, the draft rules require cities to maintain, or local governments to maintain, sufficient climate-friendly areas to accommodate at least 30% of their needed housing units over time. And so there's required analysis and findings for each new CFA area designation or expansion of a CFA. So as cities grow over time and they may need to identify additional CFA areas or expand those, there's the requirement to also look at potential displacement impacts and also to promote more affordable housing options for a broader variety of people to live in climate-friendly areas and to work in climate-friendly areas. Lastly, within the proposed rules, tied into the new requirement for housing production strategy work for cities with population over 10,000, the rules would require every housing production strategy report to look at fair and equitable housing production goals within those climate-friendly areas, to take a look at what progress have we made over the last 6 or 8 years, and what strategy should we use to promote that housing production within climate-friendly areas. Those are the rules in a nutshell as they relate to climate-friendly areas. Next slide. All right, Evan, I don't know if you want to. I think essentially we're here for questions, and I think the key question here is that given the commission does not have the authority to require community advisory committees, how else can rules center the voices of priority populations in decision making? And I want to be clear, when we say the commission can't require, this is based on our advice from our legal counsel. And it's not requiring community advisory committees, but it's the particular structure that we've proposed in the version of the rules that you saw at our last RAC meeting. So we're very open to ideas about how we can meet those goals in a different way. Looks like we have a question from Michael.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, hi, thank you. I had a question about accessibility and the link between accessibility and equity for people with disabilities. Basically, without due consideration to making sure that everything is accessible for people with disabilities, we will never have equity. We will never reach an equitable outcome. And so I was looking through the rules, and I may have missed this because it's 260 pages, but I wasn't sure if we define concisely what accessibility means and how different jurisdictions should understand their obligation to provide accessibility.
It's a great question, Michael. I'm sorry, Evan, did you have a response?
No, I'm not sure we distributed the definitions. Have we, Bill? Have we, the 005?
Yeah, the definitions that go in the rule, we haven't sent those out yet. They have some cleaning up to do, but they'll come out next month.
Yeah.
Is accessibility included as one of the definitions?
Absolutely, yeah. And we can work with you to make sure that it's adequate to the task, for sure.
Great, thank you.
Great, thank you. And Al?
Yeah, is there a mechanism to make this part of updates to acknowledge citizen participation programs? I know in the past, I've come across neighborhood organizations which said you had to live in the area, which had the effect of excluding landlords. I had another one where you had to own the area, which had the effect of excluding tenants. And another one where you had to live within the city, which excluded folks who lived in areas that were candidates to coming into an urban growth boundary. In each of those cases, it wasn't a matter of saying you have to go get an advisory committee, but whatever your advisory committee is, has to meet whatever are appropriate standards for citizen participation. Is that a way of getting at this?
That is a bigger question the department has been looking at, and including removing the term citizen from our rules, but it's not part of this rulemaking. The unfortunately named Citizen Involvement Advisory Committee has a bunch of new staff on it, or sorry, a bunch of new volunteers engaged in it, who are very interested in making sure that resident involvement of Oregonians is more inclusive. And so that's a separate effort. And I'm happy to defer to other staff who may know more of the details about that.
I can jump in, just working with Sadie Carney in the policy office on that initiative. Al, thank you. What you raise is a really great question, and I think we want to think about it a little bit more as well. But I would go to those sections that Evan mentioned, Al, and make sure that really frankly, if I may offer, what's in the draft rules is actually far stronger than any public involvement plan I've ever seen, because it includes that spatial analysis of who's actually on the ground and then requiring that consultation with those community members. So let's look really hard at those rules for this rulemaking process and, be in dialogue about updating kind of those, requiring updates of the goal 1 compliance, the public involvement plans, I think is a really provocative answer and in line with another sort of work program you'll see on the department's policy agenda that's also published this commission meeting packet if you're interested. Thanks, long kind of insidery answer, but thanks for raising it.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks, Alan, Kirsten.
Yeah, and I would, thank you, Kirsten, that's very helpful. And I would note that in the draft, renters are identified as a priority population. So low income and moderate income renters specifically. And so you can look at that list and in theory, in the draft, communities are encouraged to figure out how to specifically engage those communities.
Any other questions and thoughts, and specifically, asking about if there are any ideas to center the voices of priority or underserved populations in decision making without having the specific advisory committee structure. Amy has her hand up.
Hello, and I pronounce my name M.A., by the way.
M.A., thank you.
Yeah, what I guess a suggestion that I've heard is using existing advisory and committee structures and making requirements for diverse representation on those, like planning commissions and public advisory committees that are stood up for like transportation plan updates and comprehensive plan updates, with something like that, and making a requirement that those be more representative of historically marginalized and underserved communities. Would something like that be within DLCE's purview?
Again, that would probably be in, oh, sorry, Bill, go ahead if you'd like. Please.
Thank you, Emma. Yeah, no, we did have this conversation with Department of Justice Counsel, and the problem is the commission has broad authority to set rules over a set of, I think it's 3 different chapters of the statute that have to do with the statewide planning program, coordinated land use planning. The rules or the laws in the statute, for whatever reason, about planning commissions, there's 2, I think one for cities, one for counties, are completely different statutes that the commission doesn't have rulemaking authority for. So he was pretty clear with us that it would be very difficult. It would be, probably not legal for us to have our commission assert authority over the makeup of a planning commission, or to require kind of a planning commission like body like we had proposed, and that would be very difficult for us to say that we had the authority to do that legally. So I think that's that doesn't really make a lot of sense, but that's the law, unfortunately.
And we'll check that for the goal 1 process. If I may, I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
I guess my next question was, what would give you authority to do that?
Bill, if I could just offer here, and if I could, on the goal 1, goal and or rule writing, goal amendment and or rule writing process, let's take a look at that there. And Bill and Kevin, if you don't mind helping me get this in front of Steve at our next opportunity, again, it might be out of scope for this rulemaking process, but I'm, curious as we scope the effort to modernize engagement practices with cities and counties in Oregon, that we do look at something like this, which is basically would be possibly a similar strategy to what is actually proposed in this rule, which is do your groundwork, find out your demographies, and match your committees accordingly. So I think that's the goal, and I appreciate you raising it. It's big. It's on the front burner of our department's thinking these days. So thank you.
Thank you. And Chair MacArthur, did you have a comment on this topic?
Yes, just thank you really quickly. And I think I'm so glad we're talking about this. It's a really important part of this work, as well as all the work we do in the department and at the local level. I know we'll do some more work, as we pointed out, as Kirsten and others have pointed out, on the rules, but there's rules and there's incentives. And I think that we'll be looking forward to thinking through the grant process, because I'm assuming that many of these communities will need to have dollars from ODOT and DLCD and other organizations to actually complete the work. And we should think about how to incentivize the right composition of advisory boards to do this work.
Yeah, thanks, Chair MacArthur. And Mary Kyle.
Thank you. I think that the commission, the agency and commission may have more power on this than maybe you're thinking at the moment, because for under goal 1, existing goal 1, which does require for citizen involvement committees to represent a broad interests, a broad array of the interests related to land use and transportation decision making. And for those cities that are using their planning commission as their citizen involvement committee required under goal 1, I think you have maybe more power and authority than you may be cautiously assuming. So maybe be a little bit more pushy. Secondly, your partner agency, ODOT, has money to give. You have money to give, but it's not very much. ODOT is the one that funds TSPs and RTPs and things like that for the most part, and they can tie that funding to, I believe, to requiring that a local government has had a equitable, diverse public participation process in the way you've defined or drafted in your rules here. ODOT, in my opinion, should have a similar set for how they dole out money to support this type of work. And I think that will result in the kinds of changes we want to see at the local government in terms of who's having a say in transportation decision-making.
Thanks, Mary Kyle. And I have hands up again from Al and Michael. So Al, go ahead.
Just following up on Emma's comment, and Mary Kyle said exactly what I was going to say. I would just follow that up by suggesting that perhaps you could ask legal counsel a more refined version of your question, which is if a city chooses to have its planning commission also be its citizen advisory committee, then it'll have to have it meet the goal 1 standards for participation. And they have the choice of not doing that and having a separate citizen participation committee. But if you're talking about the makeup of your committee and then the city chooses to have a planning commission do that, it can't trump your authority. That would be my position. I think the Attorney General would agree.
Thanks, Al. And Michael.
Yeah, hi again. I had just one quick comment about the spatial mapping, and I certainly understand the value of spatial mapping for identifying where priority populations live. But on the other hand, if we're looking through the lens of accessibility, if I am trying to get on or use public transport in the part of town where I live, and I need to go somewhere else, I also need to be sure that the area where I'm going is also accessible. And so I want to make sure that we're not just thinking about the priority areas or designations, but we're thinking about complete networks and systems.
That's a great point, and we are thinking about that too. In the draft rules, you'll see key destinations defined, and research shows that one of the biggest predictors of transit ridership isn't just where people are concentrated where they live, but where they go. So when there's high numbers of employment or a lot of stores and downtowns, that's where we can get more efficiency out of the transit system. So we're thinking about that as well, and we're also thinking about connecting the dots between those two.
Great, thanks, Cody and Michael. All right, thanks to everyone for those great questions and comments, really helpful. I think with that, we can move into the next topic for today, and that's the draft rules for high quality bike, pedestrian, and transit improvements. And so I think I'll turn it over to Bill in just a second. And so here, Bill will provide some context and then really go through the key points of those draft rules. That this will be the first draft meetings where you're really seeing that set of rules. And then we'll have time for a little bit of Q&A and spend most of our time on this topic in breakout rooms. And we have some key questions in the breakout rooms, and we'll really be asking you to reflect on these pedestrian, bicycle, and think about pedestrian, bicycle, and public transportation travel, and do the rules accomplish the goals of making that kind of travel connected, safe, and comfortable for people that are walking, biking, using transit. So thinking about whether the rules accomplish those goals and whether you see any implementation challenges. So maybe be thinking about that as Bill goes through the presentation here. So Bill, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sylvia. Again, Bill Holmes from DLCD staff, and I'm going to move through these relatively briskly to hopefully give us enough time to have a good conversation in our breakout sessions, and of course, happy to answer any questions after I've gone through these. So this is a key piece, I think, of what we want to do in this rulemaking overall is make improvements to all the different ways of getting around other than having to just drive a car. So these rules, they basically are guiding local cities and counties in how they plan for these different systems. There's rules on the books now. They've been on the books for decades that require local governments to do this work. This isn't new. I think what the draft rules do, I think, is just really go into a lot more detail for each of these modes than the existing rules, and require a little bit more in some circumstances in places where we think it's important and that we need to move the ball. So that's what we're trying to do here in order to meet our goals. But I do just want to emphasize that it's not like local governments don't do this work already. And again, just to be real clear, this is work that happens at the time that a local government amends a local transportation system plan. So it's not something that necessarily happens immediately after these rules are adopted, but the next time a local government goes to adopt a local transportation system plan. So just why are we doing this? Well, we've been directed to. The governor's executive order, speaks for pretty broadly to this. It says amendments to the transportation planning rules, which is what these are, that direct changes to the transportation plans of metropolitan planning areas, those are the cities and counties within those areas, to meet GHG reduction goals or to meet our climate targets. And the commission, a little bit more specifically, said, as part of what we're doing, we need to ensure that local governments we're requiring local governments to plan for high quality pedestrian, bicycle, and transit infrastructure. So that's what we're trying to do here. And it's a super critical piece of what we're trying to accomplish overall. Why is it important? Well, I think for a lot of reasons. Some of this, I think, I almost didn't have this slide at first, and I was because it's just kind of in my background of my head, like this. Of course, this is why we do it, but I think it was important to say it. Why do we want these things? We want high quality, connected, safe, and comfortable. And I guess I should also say accessible. I don't mean to not say that, but I kind of think that's important everywhere. Pedestrian, bicycle, and public transportation systems for both our equity and climate goals. It's equity, but to allow more freedom for people who can't drive. That can be for lots of different reasons. It's because of age, it's because of disability, maybe it's because of just they can't afford to do that, because it's expensive. And our system is not set up very well right now for people who can't drive in a lot of places. It's difficult to, live daily life all the time. So I think it's critical just from that piece to improve equity. It improves equity, again, by lowering barriers. I think a big one is cost for access to everyday needs. This is kind of along the same lines, but even people who can afford to drive, it's expensive. And there may be families out there who are having a difficult time affording everything that they want to because they have to have a car, or maybe they have to have a second car. And if we can build a system where maybe they don't even have to have that second car anymore, maybe they don't have to have a car at all, because there's enough other options out there, that's saving them a lot of money, even if they're not so poor that they can't afford a car. It's still helping those households, helping those families. So we think that's an important equity piece. And of course, climate, by reducing the need to drive. And why is that important? Well, Cody is really going to talk more about vehicle miles traveled and what the role of the amount of driving is in how that to meet our climate goals a little bit later today. But I think it's pretty clear, the whole point of a lot of this rulemaking is we're trying to make it, reduce the amount of driving that happens because driving creates the pollution that they're trying to reduce. So that's the big picture. So we're going to start with pedestrian here. And I just want to be very clear. Every time we say pedestrian, we mean systems for people who are using mobility devices and people walking. So it's not just walking. And if there's a better word than pedestrian that we can use, I'm happy to hear it and to use that word instead. But I try to be very clear just to use the term pedestrian, not say walking, because I want to be inclusive of people who are using a variety of devices or getting however they get around, kind of at that pedestrian scale. And what we're trying to do is have a complete and connected network that provides for safe and comfortable travel for all people, okay? And the goal is within urban areas, we want to serve most trips under 1 mile. Not every trip, but most trips under 1 mile should be able to be handled by the pedestrian system. So getting into the rules that implement this, you'll see kind of a familiar pattern through these different modes of the kind of how the rules work. There's a rule that kind of, the 500 here in this case, kind of gives an overview of like, okay, this is what, it has some of those things we talked about in the last slide about we want to serve trips under 1 mile with this system. It should be safe, comfortable, and accessible. And it applies to people who are using mobility devices. That's what this rule is, kind of that overview. 505 is what inventory requirements are for the local governments when they're doing their transportation system plan. It's important to know what you've got on the ground now before you move forward figuring out what you're going to plan for next. So those are the inventory requirements, and we've dialed those, I think, to a point which are reasonable and implementable by local governments, but we're still, I think, trying to push maybe a little bit more than some local governments have now. So we're trying to get that balance right of making sure that, we're not asking for every single sidewalk in the entire city on every local street, because we understand that's just too much in a lot of places. Rule 510, and I'll talk a little bit about this in the next slide, is the requirements that we're putting down for the pedestrian system and what the minimum kind of plan should look like. And then 520 is basically, okay, you figured out what you've got, you figured out where the holes are, you figured out what you need to get to those requirements. What's missing? Where are the gaps? What are the projects you need to fill those gaps? That's putting that together. That's what that rule is about. But the pedestrian system requirements, real quick. The first one is wider and more protected sidewalks in certain places, and I think it's we're trying to be sensitive to the different contexts, right? That different streets and different neighborhoods have. So it's important to have wider and more protected sidewalks along bigger and faster streets. And you'll see in the rules it talks about arterials and collectors, and you can think of those as arterials as being kind of the biggest streets and collectors kind of being the next smaller streets, and then there's local streets, which are kind of your neighborhood streets in broad brush, if you're not a transportation planner person. And then also in neighborhoods with concentrations of priority populations, and that's the term that we're using right now, but like Evan said, we're going to be moving over to a different term. And then also in climate friendly areas, in those places, that will be designated climate friendly areas. We want to make sure are pedestrian oriented, so that we are requiring high quality facilities in those locations. That we're dedicating a significant portion of the right of way in climate friendly areas to pedestrian uses. That's sidewalks, but also plazas and other kind of pedestrian pieces. These are places that are supposed to be very friendly for people that are pedestrians walking or using mobility devices, and we just want to make sure that there's lots of space for them, and that's a priority that we're using the right of way in prioritizing pedestrians. And this is something that we've definitely heard from folks is important is planning for enhanced tree canopy and natural living infrastructure in key areas, and those key areas are climate friendly areas again, as well as those neighborhoods that have concentrations of priority populations because of heat island effect and lots of other reasons why it's an important and healthy thing. We found out in June of this year that not having a lot of shade is not a great thing when you have really, really, really hot weather, and we're going to be having a lot more hot weather in the future. So this is an adaptation strategy, as well as I think as a mitigation strategy, and making it easier to walk means people drive less. So it's both. And then making sure that we have enhanced crossings of larger streets in key areas, and that we're in those key areas again are the climate friendly areas and neighborhoods with those concentrations of priority populations. Making sure that we're enhanced crossings are places where the crossings are marked, signaled, and are really very clear to people who are driving that this is a place where people who need to cross the street have priority, and making sure that those are happening at a frequency in those places in particular, across those big streets, those arterials and collectors, that it's easy to get around and that those streets aren't a barrier. So that was real quick. That was the pedestrian system. Now I'm going to move into bicycle. And again, I think everywhere we say bicycle, we don't mean just people riding bikes. We mean people using electric bicycles, scooters, or other kind of similar scaled size speed vehicles. This is a super gray area here because you start getting into higher powered electric bicycles, and then all of a sudden, what's the line between that and a moped and a motorcycle? And people have electric skateboards. There's all kinds of different vehicles out there that maybe haven't even been invented yet, and it's a little bit difficult. There's a term called micromobility that a lot of people use. I kind of think it's a fad, so I haven't been using that term in the rules. But when we say bicycle, we're trying to mean all these different things. So, and I just want to be clear about that. And again, we want a complete and connected network that provides for safe, efficient, and comfortable travel for all people. And I think in particular, when we talk about bicycles, we're talking about people of all ages. We want, I think a successful bicycle network is one where you've got kids that are able to use it safely, and people aren't freaking out about them being on a bicycle along the side of a busy street. That would be success in my mind. And kind of like pedestrian, we have a goal here. We want to serve most trips, not every trip, most trips under 3 miles within an urban area should be able to be served by this network, and people should feel comfortable to be able to do that. And I think that's achievable. Again, just real quick, the rules. 600 is that overview, 605 is the inventory. 610, I'll talk about here a little bit more in a second, the requirements for that bicycle system. 620 is how you put together that project list. 630 is an additional rule in the bicycle section, which talks about bicycle parking requirements, which, you know, if you're riding your bike and it's important to get around, you need to be able to place to store that or park that when you're either at home or you're going out and about. So it's an important piece. And I'll talk about that a little more in a slide here in a second. So the bicycle system requirements, again, higher levels of protection and separation along bigger and faster streets. Basically, you know, the one little paint stripe along an arterial in most places isn't going to cut it anymore. And I think that's we're going away from that into more protection and separation. And that's necessary in order to get people to feel comfortable riding bicycles. The people that aren't gung-ho on bicycles, you know, if we need to get beyond that in order to actually move more people onto those trips that are under 3 miles. We need to get more regular people that aren't wearing spandex onto bicycles. Planning for a connected network of bicycle facilities for all ages and abilities. That's those protected lanes, but it's also probably a set of low speed streets, neighborhood streets that are connected to each other and connected to those networks that you know, connect to the key destinations, and to have that kind of connected and complete network where all the intersections are really clear and safe for people to use and cross bigger streets. Things like that are really important. Separated or protected facilities on big streets, those are collectors and arterials in climate friendly areas. That's what we're saying is kind of the minimum required in those areas, is that you need to have those busy streets in those areas need to have separated or protected facilities. That's kind of the minimum in those places. And you know, we're happy to have discussions about that. We know that's kind of a big move, but you know, the point I always make to folks is every place around the world where we have high numbers of people who ride bikes, that's what they've got. They've got separated protected facilities on streets. So it's important. I think it's critical. And then on busy streets outside of climate friendly areas and other places where it's not required as part of that connected network, we're saying that at least the minimum on those busy streets is a buffered bicycle lane. And that's basically as a couple. It's a little bit more. It's a little bit better than just a line of paint. It's a couple lines of paint with some lines in between. It gives it a little bit more space between that fast traffic and those lanes. And that's just basically a minimum. And it's not something that we would necessarily expect a lot of people to be able to use, but that's what that connected network is for all people to use. And we'll still have a couple of facilities out there that might be just more for those gung-ho folks, but we at least want to give them that minimum level of protection. Parking, real quick. I just want to be real clear. The TPR for decades has had requirements for bicycle parking for some uses, having mostly retail and multifamily. They're pretty minimal requirements, but they are there, and jurisdictions do have to follow those rules. We're kind of expanding those a little bit into a rule. More uses will be required to have parking. I think there's probably a lot of jurisdictions that already have pretty similar requirements for a lot of these uses, so I don't think this is too out to lunch for a lot of places, particularly in metropolitan areas. Requirements in some situations for covered and secure parking, I think particularly in residential locations, but a few other places where maybe in work locations, things like that, where people are going to be parking for a longer term than just like stopping real quick. And then long-term parking in some situations have to provide charging for electric bicycles, which are going to be a larger share of the market, kind of like with cars. You know, they really allow people to erase hills, is what I heard. You know, the good term of using it. It allows people to just not worry about hills and large cargo so much, to take their kids around or go shopping easier. Those electric bicycles make that easier. So charging for those and other vehicles and devices. So we know there's a lot of scooters out there that need to be charged. People may be using mobility devices, and may be handy for them to be able to charge those in these locations. So we just want to make sure that we're prepared for the different things that are coming out. So that's bicycles. And I know I'm really flying through these quick, but I want to make sure we have some time for discussion, comments, and questions in our breakout session. So transit planning, it's a little bit different here. We're planning for local, regional, and intercity public transportation. The system's supposed to serve people both within urban areas, also between cities. So that's I think both pieces of what we're trying to do here. It's a little bit different than the bicycle and pedestrian because in most places, not everywhere, there's some outliers there, but in most places, and we're just kind of assuming that in the rules here, the city or the county that's doing the planning is not the transit service provider, right? It's usually a transit district or some other entity that's doing that service. So we have to be real careful about what these rules look like because this is the plan for the transportation system plan for the local government. Now, the transit service providers, like every other entity, public entity in Oregon, has to be consistent with local comprehensive plans. But we don't want to. We're trying to be real careful about stepping on transit's turf here. So I just want to be real upfront about that. So a lot of what you'll see in our rules is requiring coordination with those transit service providers. That's the local transit service provider. That's those intercity transit providers. You know, a lot of places there's multiple different providers serving a single community. In some places it's just one or two, but in some places you've got a whole bunch. So we want to make sure that you're coordinated with all of them. Cities and counties have to plan, and this is really where we've trying to focus in the rules, supporting land use and infrastructure for those transit services that are operating within the community. So it's critical to have those land uses that are near transit to be supportive of transit, to have that level of density, and to have those destinations that are planned close to transit. And instead of assuming that transit is going to come to you. So I think we're trying to do that. And then infrastructure, which we'll talk a little bit more here in detail, but I think that's a key piece as well. And the rules, they don't include transit service planning, like where the bus goes, what the routing is of a certain bus route, what the fare is, what the timetable is, when the buses start and stop, how often they run, all that stuff. We want more transit. We want to plan. We want to support all those transit agencies that are doing that hard work of getting those buses on the street every day. But that's not the job that we're trying to do here. And I just wanted to be real clear about that. So the rules kind of set very similarly. Overview of how the public transportation system is supposed to work, inventory, what's happening right now, what are the services that are on the street, what does it look like. 710, we'll talk about here in a second what the public transportation system requirements are for local governments. 720 is doing, again, putting together a list. And then we have another rule here is the 750, which is kind of attached to this. It's a transportation options plan. I have a slide about that, and I'll talk about that in a second here. So local governments have to plan for a connected public transportation network that serves key destinations. So that's, again, for all these pieces have to be coordinated with those transit service providers to make sure it's something that makes sense. But a key piece of that is identifying priority transit corridors that are planned for the highest level of transit service in the community. And it's really critical that this is a piece that the local government coordinates closely with the transit service providers, but this is something the local government needs to do because the pieces that are on top of that are those land use pieces, which is what the local government controls. Make sure that along those transit corridors we're having appropriate land uses and to support that transit, and then also that we're planning transit supportive facilities along those corridors, not just the priority corridors, but also the rules also required you to identify other corridors, which may be kind of those less frequent routes. And not every route has to go along a corridor, and the routes move and buses change. So these are kind of like the key ones that I think are super important. That we want to plan for transit supportive facilities along those corridors. The key ones being transit stops. And kind of all the different things that go along with transit stops, shelters, signs, benches, maybe there's digital information, things like that, lighting, all sorts of stuff that could go on a transit stop. We want to make sure local governments are planning for those, allowing those, and basically not getting in the way of local transit providers of being able to provide those for the riders. So in every place we're trying to make sure that that's something that's easy to do. And the other one is transit priority facilities. Those are less often seen so far in Oregon. You'll see those some places in the Portland area. See them, I think, a lot probably in the Eugene Springfield area with their bus rapid transit. But even short of full bus rapid transit, you'll see signals that can stay green longer for transit or be red, turn green sooner, things like that. Transit signal priority is what that's called. There are other facilities like queue jumps where buses can get around traffic, all the way up to semi-dedicated or dedicated transit lanes. Those are the kinds of facilities, and particularly these key corridors, that we want to be able to see more and more. And in many of these places, the local governments control the right of way, the local streets, and we want to make sure that those local governments are planning those in coordination with those local governments or with the transit service providers in those key corridors to have more and more of those, so that transit becomes more and more of a priority and a preferred method of travel in those corridors. And then we want to make sure local governments are coordinated with transit service providers to identify intercity needs. We have we have a handful of intercity services in the state now. It's well short of what we would need in order to meet our goals of being able to meet our climate goals. So identifying those needs and working to improve them is not a lot local governments can do, but as much as they can to speed travel in and out of local jurisdiction, in and out of cities, into terminals, things like that would be helpful. Transportation options, real quick, and this might be an unfamiliar term to some people. You may have heard it called, if you're wonky, you may have heard it called transportation demand management, but the term is mostly used now as transportation options. These are mostly programmatic things that are implemented to help people understand. There's a lot of education. There's a lot of sometimes there's things like discounts on different methods of getting around, lots of transit passes, things like that, different programmatic things to make it easier for people to get around without having to drive. So we are requiring local governments, and this is actually in the TPR right now. It's in the rules. There's like a sentence that says have a transportation options plan or transportation demand management plan. That's it. That's all it says. You have to have one. It doesn't say what you have to do. So we do a little bit more detail. We've got a rule on it now that says you have to have a transportation options element. You have to coordinate closely with transportation options providers and transit service providers. Sometimes those are the same entity. And sometimes, the local governments are doing some transportation options things as well. So it's kind of all over the map in the state, but we're being general here and saying you have to coordinate closely with them and to identify existing programs, services, and projects, and to identify what the future needs are and to have that in the local TSP. So I know I went really super hyper speed through that. I hope that wasn't too much of a wall of stuff, but happy to answer any questions right now, and then we'll go into breakout. Sylvia.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. That's really a lot of great information, and thanks for laying it out so clearly. And we have time for some clarifying Q&A, and then we're going to get into breakout rooms to really talk about, do these rules meet the goals that are intended here of creating like safe, comfortable, efficient, accessible transportation for people who aren't driving, and really, are there any implementation challenges that you see with these rules? But happy to answer clarifying questions before we get into breakouts. Mary Kyle.
Thank you. Aside from the content of the rules, which we'll be talking about, I've lost track of what the timeline is for complying with these rules. And last meeting, I think it was pretty consensus of needing a master timeline for everything in the proposed rules, which we haven't seen yet. So just taking the pedestrian, bike, and transit planning rules, do you have a timeline embedded in here?
Yeah, so I think I did mention this. It's that these are requirements for local transportation system plans and how they work. So it's going to be different in lots of different places, right?
So
there are going to be places.
Our TSPs currently on a required timeline. That's one. And two, if a metropolitan area has an RTP that's scheduled to be done prior to its next prior to individual TSPs, why not incorporate it into that? So the soonest between a TSP and an RTP. RTPs are on a schedule. I'm not aware of TSPs being on a required schedule. So are they?
Not a required schedule. They have a planning horizon. So each TSP is built for 20 years, and usually they're updated more frequently than every 20 years. But that varies depending on the local jurisdiction, when they're able to get funding and time and resources able to do that, when they feel like they need to do it. I mean, sometimes we'll see, in my other hat as operating the Transportation Growth Management Program, we'll see applications for people that have had a TSP that's only 5 years old, want to do an update. And sometimes updates happen much more frequently. I think it's kind of across the map. There's some places do like kind of small updates frequently, and so the way we've written the rules, I think, it says once we're past a certain date, and it would be early next year, and we can talk about that if that's the right time or not. Anytime you do an update to a transportation system plan, you have got to meet all the updated rules. So I don't have a good answer for you, like what that looks like in any particular jurisdiction, because it varies a lot.
Right. So I think what I heard the answer is somewhere between 1 and 20, everywhere between 1 and 20 years. That might not be every 20 years, but given the urgency of everything that we are talking about, that seems way too indefinite. And I completely understand that local governments need funding to do this. So again, tying funding to getting TSPs or incorporating it in an RTP, which are done more frequently, and have a timeline. I just think that seems unacceptable to have an indefinite.
Well, I'll answer that in a couple different ways. There's two, I think a couple different questions there. One is about RTPs, which I'll talk real quick about just about the 7 metropolitan areas that aren't Portland. We don't have the authority to. The regional transportation plan is a federal requirement of the Metropolitan Planning Organization, which is not something that the commission has authority over. So we're trying to do as much with local transportation system plans as we can. Is that, like in our perfect world, the ideal way of doing planning at a regional level? It is not. Is that what we can do with the authority that the commission has today? It is. So that's that. I don't think it's ideal. I don't think anyone on staff would say that it is, but that's what we've got.
I'm trying to find a more definite deadline that actually is funded for transportation updates. So if that, again, bringing your partner agency into this, and I know there are others with questions or comments, but what you described is the current TSP lack of definite timelines just seems really unacceptable for everything we've been doing on this rule.
So that's the other piece I was going to say is we are working with ODOT and other agencies to say what are the sideboards on funding, and that's outside of the rulemaking process, right? We're not but we're for lots of different pieces of this rulemaking. It's not necessarily going to be in the rule, but it's going to be attached to a funding condition that you have a TSP that meets updated requirements.
I'll just finally say one thing. We spent a lot of time, talking about equity, and it's not as though the current situation is equitable, and particularly transportation funding and the degree to which, or the, relative spending on various transportation modes. So the longer it goes on under business as usual, as we currently have, the more inequity in how we spend our transportation dollars gets built into concrete, literally. So there's something that's not coming together here for me on this particular item of planning and investing in bicycle transportation and transit in a timely fashion. Thanks.
Thanks, Mary Kyle. And a few more hands, Patricia.
Just a quick comment. At AERP, we talk a lot about traffic calming things, and it didn't jump out at me as I was reviewing these. So I'm just wondering how that fits into this scheme.
Yeah, thank you. There's another kind of modal element, which is streets and highways planning, which should be the 800s in the rules, which we haven't been able to share yet. We're still working on the details of that, and I'm hopeful that some of that would live in those set of rules. I think mostly with the bike and pedestrian stuff, we're trying to make sure that there's excellent facilities, no matter the kind of that are consistent with the context of the street that they're along. So it's not perfect, but I think when we get those other set of rules out there, hopefully we'll be addressing that as well.
Thank you. And Emma.
Thank you. I was hoping to get an update on just the enforcement. I think this has been a rule that's forthcoming, but since there are conversations between DLCD and ODOT and there's talk of funding, I'd just love to know a verbal update. If cities can't comply, then what? What's the enforcement kind of draft rule looking like?
Well, I think it depends on what piece of the rules we're talking about. In the case of updating a transportation system plan, if it's funded by the state's going to want to make sure that the TSP is consistent with the state's rules. So that there's that piece of it. There's the financing of the planning itself, and then I think the remedy for an adopted plan that doesn't meet the goals or it doesn't meet the state's rules is an appeal to LUBA. That's probably I don't think we have another way around that right now that we've been able to identify that would be for updating of transportation system plan.
And then what happens when different state rules, even within this packet, are in conflict with one another? Some of the requirements that I'm seeing in this section, I love bike ped transit planning. It's something I'm very passionate about. And some of the draft rules could require us to widen roadways and eliminate housing, making existing housing that is more likely to be serving renters and low-income folks no longer a viable residence and property. So when there's conflicts like that, then what? Is it just a local jurisdiction? You have to deal with anti-displacement, but you have to follow the state rules? Well,
I think we want to make sure that we want to identify where you think that that's an issue and address that, because I think that's not the outcome we would want to see as well. Yeah.
I think Amanda might want to weigh in on this from the ODOT perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Sylvia. Apologies, my camera's not working. So yeah, to Emma's question on kind of enforcement, and I think she did raise the idea of funding. DLCD did ask ODOT to look at ways that we might help support implementation of the rule. So we don't have anything concrete yet. We have looked at options. I will share that some of those options include looking at withholding funds until a jurisdiction has a compliant plan. That wouldn't be state funds. We don't have the ability to restrict any of those. That would likely be federal funds. Again, since this is focused on the metropolitan area, it would likely look at some kind of agreement between ODOT and the MPOs or some of the larger MPOs, the TMAs, that says something to the effect of the MPO cannot award funding to a jurisdiction that does not have a compliant plan. There's obviously a lot to figure out if we consider this. The biggest one is going to be the timing of that requirement, because we want to make sure we're not penalizing local jurisdictions unjustly when they haven't had the opportunity, either through funding or resources, staff resources, to update their plan. So that timing is going to be critical there, while also thinking about Mary Kyle's point of, trying to affect things sooner rather than later. The other key consideration is, what does compliant mean? So I think from ODOT's perspective, we would say pretty strongly it's not policing the content of the plan. It would be some kind of self-certification process where the local jurisdiction would say, that they updated their plan, send a letter to the MPO saying they've updated their plan, and here's the justification for why they feel that it meets the intent of the transportation planning rule. So again, a lot to work out there. We're having some early discussions with some of the MPOs, AOC, LOC, and some others to see what opportunities there are, understand those challenges before putting anything really officially out there. But just sharing with you, that's some of the discussions we've been having, with likely some kind of recommendation on options coming forward, I would say in late October, early November. Thanks.
Thanks, Amanda. And let's get Julie's question, and then we really need to move into the breakout room. So Julie, go ahead.
So I guess my question ties back to what Mary Kyle was talking about in terms of timelines. The the scenario planning requirements. So going back a couple months, I'm totally losing track of what, I mean, I know there's timelines associated with that, but do those timelines then presumably include requirements for updating transportation system plans, which would then bring in these requirements, at least for the jurisdictions that are covered by that? And if, like I said, I'm losing track of it. And so my very direct question to DLCD staff is, when are we going to see a comprehensive timeline of how all of these different things interplay?
So we are working on that timeline of the pieces that have a time that are in the draft rules, around the climate friendly areas, around the scenario planning, and some other pieces that are in here. I think we want to make sure that we're connecting that with the housing work also that's required by the statutes required of the department to set rules for. So we want to make sure that's also, because we understand that's a big piece that local governments are dealing with as well. And so I think, yeah, we're still working on putting that together. The transportation system plan isn't necessarily something that has a timeline on it, like we discussed. So that would be independent of that. And I don't know, Cody, if you want to address how that would fit into the scenario planning.
Well, I guess what I'm trying to say is, does the scenario planning have any requirements for updating transportation system plans?
Yes, it does.
So then that would then trigger some of these other things, presumably.
Yes, for the Eugene Springfield and Salem Kaiser areas, there are local adoption to, get in line and implement the scenario plan. So that's set after the adoption schedule of the scenario plan. I'm happy to send those to you just to refresh, but we will definitely get those are already in the draft of the timeline now that we're working on.
So, and when will we see that draft?
Bill? Or I presume next week.
Yeah, I don't know who's leading that project. That wasn't me. Was that Kevin?
Well, I don't know, but I think we will strive to have it for you in October. As I noted earlier, we're looking for some guidance from the commission on some of the deadlines that we've got. So that will, of course, inform that overall schedule. But yeah, I think we need to have that in front of you for our next meeting.
I would appreciate that. I mean, and even if things are going to change, it would be helpful as we comment on where they are now to see where that is, so that we can then inform that need for change.
Right.
Thanks, Julie and team. All right, so appreciate the questions. And in a second, we're going to get into breakout rooms to spend a little bit more time on the content of these rules for bicycle, pedestrian, and transit travel. And so here are the questions that we're really going to be focusing on. So as Bill explained in his presentation, the rules are really intended to make sure that bike ped transit travel is safe, connected, efficient, accessible, all of the things. And so the questions for the group is, do you think the rules accomplish those goals? Particularly, there are some for pedestrian travel, really hoping that the network serves most trips under 1 mile and in urban areas, and for bicycle networks that they're serving trips under 3 miles, and that public transportation systems are well connected in urban areas and between regions and cities. So do you think the rules accomplish these goals, and are there any implementation challenges? That's really the focus of the breakout rooms. And so in a minute, we will get into those rooms, and we'll have a facilitator and someone taking notes in each one. And really we'll go around the room to have a conversation and make sure to hear from one, but we also want to make sure that you're talking to each other. So if you hear ideas or comments and you're like, yeah, I really agree with that, speak up. Or if you're like, I'm not so sure about that, I have concerns, speak up as well. We want to make sure we're having that conversation between folks. So Ingrid has put us into breakout rooms, and let's be in those breakout rooms until 11:05, so half an hour there. So staff, make sure you kind of have that number in your brain, 11:05, but we'll get a reminder when time's almost up. And then after that, we'll do some report outs. So we'll ask RAC members to report out and encourage people that haven't reported out before to do those report outs, or if it's been a long time, just so that we're bringing more voices into the conversation. So with that, Ingrid, I will turn it over to you to get us into those breakout rooms, and we'll see you all again at 11:05. And just click the join button when that pops up on your screen, and you'll get into your room.
we have a gas tax, and that a lot of other communities in Oregon, I think they're just struggling to keep their streets paved so they're not really rough and so that they're not becoming reconstructs. And I think there's a need for a separate conversation about, am I back to the main group here?
We are, yes.
Okay, well, we could have a side conversation about that at some point, or I can make a comment about it.
All right, thank you, Rob. All right, welcome back, everyone. As you can hear, we were still deep in our conversation, so apologies if anyone got cut off in the breakout rooms. So hopefully you all had some good discussion on the rules, the draft rule language here, and we'll do some report outs. So we'll start, let me get my list of groups up here. So we'll start with Kevin's group. So the reporter outer is Rob Innerfeld. So we'll start with Rob, and then we'll go to Cody's team and Matt's group. So Rob, and again, these are just high level report outs, a few key, 2 or 3 high level key themes. Don't feel like you need to repeat the whole conversation. We just have about a minute apiece here to go through high level comments. So Rob, over to you.
You're muted, Rob.
I'll start. Can you go back, scroll up a bit, please? Sylvia, thanks. I think I'll start with what are the challenges and just focus on what people saw as that. I apologize for not being more in this, that we were not more in the suggestion mode, but generally that it's pretty context specific. And so if these rules are implementation oriented rather than planning oriented, that can be really challenging. That it can be difficult to determine what part of the right of way, what mode it should be allocated to if you had extra room between walking, biking, and transit. Just there was an example given from Salem just about how it took so long just to get some protected bikeways in the downtown that it's a lot of work to deliver these projects over time. I imagine it can be politically fraught too, and so requiring protected bikeways on like every major street, and every street in downtown Salem is an arterial or collector, is just a huge lift. Let's see. Talking about the need for maybe looking at parallel routes in some situations, just understanding that some of these, what the direction of some of these intent, and this adds on to something that Emma said earlier, could lead to having to widen the right of way in some cases, and that could have detrimental impacts to businesses and homeowners, although in some cases maybe it won't. So, but I think there was general agreement that when we do need to widen the right of way along a corridor, the costs are really high. Does anyone want to add anything that I might have missed?
That was great.
Okay,
Thank
thanks.
you, Rob. Thanks so much. So over to Cody's group and then Matt's group.
Yeah. Go ahead, Alex. I'll bring him up.
All right. I will go through this kind of quickly because I think it's going to be a little redundant probably from already hearing some of the same topics. I think some of the challenges are, existing right-of-ways. How are we going to balance the needs within that and not create a financial burden or create a burden on neighborhoods that are existing and how that may negatively impact them if we need to widen right-of-ways to meet the bike and pedestrian goals. I think that there's going to be some challenges. One thing that I thought was really interesting, one of our members in the group pointed out that if you're trying to walk a mile, you would be crossing 16 blocks approximately, or I think that was the number maybe, and then coming back the other way, 32, with several of those are potentially being higher order streets. And that's probably not realistic for a family, maybe for an adult. And that led to a discussion of a mile is probably too long, quarter to a half mile, maybe a better prioritization. I think some other concerns of ours is really how prescriptive the rules are and the challenges of trying to make this work for every community and be context sensitive. Each city is going to have its own unique issues to making these rules work. And I think the more rural areas of our state are going to really struggle potentially. So we discussed that a little bit. And one thing that also came out was that the transportation options plan should be its own rule. So it shouldn't just apply to transit stops. It's one of the comments. And I think I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Alex. And over to Matt's group, and then we'll go to Bill and Evan's group.
Group 3, J-Raj is going to be reporting for us.
Yeah, so I'll just highlight, just read the highlighted points. Some folks said, really focusing on the pedestrian, crossing arterials, we need more time, prioritization over on people over cars. And then if you scroll down, we talked about, safety concerns and challenges to using these kind of infrastructures, thinking about cultural and social challenges of riding bikes and taking the bus. I think another point was that I brought up was appreciating the emphasis on transit-supported facilities, especially working with immigrant and refugee communities, thinking about signage. And I think when we're doing equity analysis to examine language within populations and reflect that in the built environment. Regarding planning, talking about wish lists, push on how we require prioritization, lay out a vision, and thinking systematically and holistically with these rules, make sure systems prioritize what we need to get to. And yeah, I think that's all I'll highlight.
That's great. Thank you so much. And over to Bill's group.
Thank you. Yeah, I wasn't a very good facilitator because I was not successful in cajoling anyone to be the the report out person. So I will do it on their stead. So I did make. Hopefully everyone can see the right thing here. I made a few highlights here. The ones in green I think are kind of in a similar vein, which is we already have an existing street network and infrastructure, and we want to make sure that what I think there's concern or question about what do these rules mean for the infrastructure that's already there? What are the impacts to the neighborhoods that these existing streets go through, or the streets, and what does that look like with existing facilities, especially in particularly existing or established neighborhoods? So some questions around that in the green. In the yellow, just a couple of various things I poked out here. One about neighborhood greenways. Maybe that definition needs to be a little bit clearer about mitigating car through traffic. This one's, it's hard to justify investment on local facilities. We don't necessarily put a lot of facilities on local streets that don't carry a lot of traffic. There's a concept that all roads need to serve all users. Maybe we need to think about where it's important and really making sure that the facilities that are serving certain users are really focusing on those. And then I like to highlight this because someone said, hey, we did a TSP update recently. It's very pedestrian friendly. I'm like, there's a lot of great work that's already happening out there. That we want to recognize that and support that. And I just wanted to highlight that because I think that's happening all across the state. So thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Bill. And then over to Evan's group.
Emma presenting for us. Thanks, Emma.
Thank you. Emma Name with City of Springfield. So we opened with the overarching question of what is the problem that this additional regulation is trying to address that isn't already covered by existing rules, ODOT design guidance, or other requirements that are in place. We all want to see high quality bike ped transit, but wondering if this is the right tool and if it's maybe too prescriptive, when ultimately one of the biggest barriers is funding to implement. If we don't have funding to actually build sidewalks, but we've identified the gaps, if we don't have funding to build high quality bike facilities or have good transit service, then that's not going to get us there. You had a brief conversation about the modeling tools not being sensitive enough to be responsive to bike ped transit projects being added and removed, which is the methodology described in the draft rules for determining the constrained project list. And then with the illustrative project list, it's saying that that is a list that would meet our desired outcomes for greenhouse gas emission reduction, VMT reduction per capita, but we wouldn't be required to make cost estimates for every project on the list. So it would be impossible to know what the funding gap is to actually meet the governor's executive order of reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. So maybe revisiting that. Once again, a strong desire across our whole group for a master timeline and understanding of how all the different timing pieces work for this as well as other pieces of the rule. Equity, really needing to serve people's transportation needs safely. And I think safety is maybe not emphasized enough at the risk of other things being prioritized above it. And having the networks actually function to get people from origin to destination. We could have a fantastic multimodal street for a few blocks, but if it doesn't actually provide the network connectivity so that people can walk, bike, take transit across the whole area that they need to get to and from, it's not really going to serve the outcomes and needs. And then we also talked about how some solutions may be outside this rulemaking scope. There's potential partnership opportunities. There's a lot of creative things happening. So building on the existing efforts and then determining where are those existing efforts having hangups and obstacles in their place and how can we help overcome those. We leave flexibility to local governments to allow for lower cost kind of incremental solutions that could be a pretty effective way in ultimately achieving some of the climate and equity outcomes. So yeah, ultimately we want to see results on the ground, and there's some concern that we might be over planning and underdoing.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emma, and thanks everyone for those great report outs. Some of the key themes that I'm hearing here are really just this need for funding for implementation and concern about the cost of expanding right away to accommodate these very important uses, but kind of how do we do that? How do we do that in a already built environment, and really can all roads be built to serve all users, right? Really thinking critically about that question. Also heard a lot of you talk about the need for flexibility for governments and really being context sensitive and thinking about the different geographies and being flexible for those different needs. Really thinking about equity and prioritizing people over cars, and thinking about the cultural and social norms and challenges of taking these different modes of transportation, biking, taking the bus. And really heard about the need for connectivity, getting people to where they need to go. If you have awesome bike ped infrastructure in one area, but it's not connected to other areas, that's not serving the overall goals. And also heard about really thinking critically, how do these rules interact with other transportation planning rules, making sure there's not conflicts, redundancies, and kind of getting that master timeline of what did this all look like in the future. So appreciate all of those great ideas and conversation that you had in those breakouts. I think we're all due for a break after this great conversation. So I would suggest we get back together at 11:25. I know it's not a full 10 minutes, but we want to make sure to get enough time to talk about the draft rules for vehicle miles traveled. So 11:25, see you then. Thanks, everyone. All right, welcome back, everyone. We just have a little over half an hour left for our meeting today and want to dive into the draft rules for vehicle miles traveled. So I'm just going to turn it right over to Cody to provide some context there, and then we'll have time for some large group discussion.
Hey, thanks, Sylvia. Okay, so what I'm talking about is going to be item 7 of the RAC memo, part 1, and it's page 22. And I just want to kind of give it a little overview of how this works. Is the memo is called the Summary of Transportation System Plan Development. So next slide, Bill. Overall, just wanted to frame this with the direction that we were given. So the governor directed the LCD and ODOT in the executive order to make amendments to the TPR to change how plans are put together to meet greenhouse gas reduction goals. Specifically, the commission then gave the charge to the RAC and staff to prioritize and select projects within transportation system plans to meet these targets. So I just kind of want to give an overview of how these things interact. So just, a little bit of the larger picture. So next slide. So Bill gave you a really great presentation, and we talked about in breakout about the modal project lists. So the modal sections, transit, ped, bike, and those are in rules 500 to 800. And so what you're doing there when you're putting a plan together is just looking at modal needs. So what are the needs? What are the gaps we need to be filling for each of these mode specific elements? How this fits together is that we then collate these together to an illustrative project list. So these are project lists that are not constrained by any budgetary constraint. You can, sky's the limit here. We just have all the needs. We know there are way more needs than we have money for. In the rules that we're going to be talking about specifically here is that we are introducing the idea of a carbon budget. And so we are saying we have greenhouse gas emission targets. Those are basically VMT targets. We're applying a VMT reduction target to this illustrative project list. And I'll go into that in more detail in the following slides. Rule 205 requires a financial plan. And so this is really best practice, and most communities are doing this in their TSPs already. So we're just kind of codifying what's already there in best practice. But you would, scan what income you have from different resources and put together what's the available money we're going to have for the next 20 years for the plan to pay for all this stuff. So that really becomes the constraint over, okay, now that we have all these needs, what projects can we afford to pay for? So now we got to think, what's the priority here? Because we need to, we need to get there, but we only have so much money. So Rule 200 and 205 would be kind of the sieve that you would put these projects through and have community conversations, come up with the financially constrained project list. So that, is a project list that you can afford to build likely over the next 20 years within your budget. Next slide. Another way of saying this would be in text for those of you readers that, Rule 160, we're looking at introducing requirements that kind of guide how transportation plans are put together through the analysis tools, and how, as I said, that illustrative list would meet a VMT per capita reduction target. Rule 165, this is largely pulled from existing rule language in the TPR, which just guides how cities and counties would evaluate different alternatives. So looking at things like the Federal Clean Air Act or other criteria. Rule 200 is, as we discussed, how you put together those multimodal lists into the modal list into a multimodal prioritized project list. And so that would be where you would have to meet the VMT per capita reduction target. Rule 205, as we discussed earlier, is the financial plan. So looking at the available resources to pay for things. And then Rule 210 is where you kind of end up with a transportation system plan having, here's the list of projects that we're going to pull from, and we're going to build out over the planning horizon. Okay, next slide, please. So I just want to give a really quick kind of overview of why we're talking about VMT. In transportation, there's 3 ways to reduce the pollution coming from transportation. You can reduce the carbon intensity in fuels. DEQ has a clean fuels program that's looking at different things you can put into fuels that have less of a carbon intensity when it's burned. You can make vehicles more efficient or switch them over to EV or hydrogen or some non-emitting source of energy. And you can reduce the actual travel on the roadway. So you can reduce VMT. And we're really talking about bullet point number 3. That's within the TPR and our commission's authority. Next slide. So VMT is really strongly correlated with other things besides pollution, serious fatalities and injuries. There was 3 million people injured in a car crash every year, or every year 3 million people are injured in a car crash. People spend a lot of time stuck in traffic congestion. The more driving, the more congestion. There's going to be a lot more people in our country and in our state. By 2050, 64 million more people in the US and 1 million more in Oregon. And we have an aging population and they won't be able to drive. So 90 million people will be 65 or older in 2050. Next slide. So vehicle technology and fuels aren't really a silver bullet. To meet 100% electric fleet in 2050, we really need to have every car sold today be electric. The outlook's not so good. So the top 3 best-selling cars last year are actually trucks. Only 2% of the fleet is electric. So we have a lot of work to do. It's really unclear if we're going to get there through technology. So we're going to talk about VMT. Next slide. So the connections here are that we have these targets in Division 44. They're set for actions above and beyond the fleet fuel technology changes. So they're VMT targets. They're things that local governments can do and they reduce driving. They use a specific model that projects greenhouse gas emissions, not necessarily the same model that local cities and counties use when they do their transportation planning. So in the TPR Division 12, we're talking about projects that affect VMT, and these are travel demand models. Their primary output is VMT, and they look at projects to put into these project lists. Next slide, please. So these are the rules in 160. We're introducing the idea of the VMT per capita reduction target. We have 2 approaches. We have an individual approach where a city can apply this to their TSP. It goes to the illustrative list. It's an aspirational list, so not constrained by any kind of financial resources. It's what would it take to achieve the target. We want to link to the performance targets that the performance measures will set. So if there's policies like TDM or anything else in the area, that we want to tie those there too. Very important that to base this on the greenhouse gas emission reduction targets in Division 44, we use the assumptions that are baked into the statewide transportation strategy. So we're assuming that the federal government and the state government does its fair part to make these things achievable in the future for cities. So this is an individual approach, and next slide is the regional approach. So we realize that this is probably better done at the region. We want to encourage that. As Bill talked about earlier, we can't require that. So we are putting in here that same everything would apply here, but cities can go through the MPO and their regional transportation plan to meet these requirements. There's just some section 6.7 saying, when you want to do this, here's how you would do it. Tell us that you want to do this, and that's the approach you're going to take. And then when you do a TSP and you need to show findings, submit that you are ongoing with your RTP, fulfilling these requirements. So I think I'm trying to give a pretty brief overview here, but I think the question and answer might be a better format for this. So I think we'll go back to the meeting here and happy to answer your questions.
Great, thanks, Cody. So looking at folks to see if there's any questions. And also, of course, just any comments on the approach. Do you feel like it's moving in the right direction towards advancing the climate equity goals of the project? Okay, a lot of hands just popped up. All right, let's go to Julie.
So I guess my question is, well, I guess my concern is I'm not aware of our models that we use at the regional level are not sensitive to the types of projects that would advance towards VMT reduction. And so I don't see, so I guess I have sort of 2 issues. One, they're not sensitive. So I'm imagining this model where we put in this list of financially constrained projects and we don't meet a reduction, so then we have to take a project out and put another project in or something like that as described. And I'm not aware that our model would make any difference whatsoever. The other question is sort of the idea that we would be modeling an entire illustrative list to show that we get to the goal, right? So that seems like a very heavy lift. 1, to model an entire illustrative list, and then 2, it's not going to show anything given our current models, unless there's some tool out there that I'm not aware of.
So we've been working on this with ODOT and some members of the Oregon Model Steering Committee. They have a greenhouse gas subcommittee, and we have done some looking, and it looks like we can use the existing models, travel demand models. I want to be clear that, and I think I failed to mention, the requirements proposed in this rule would say that the target reduction is on the illustrative list, but the actual financially constrained would just need to demonstrate an overall reduction in VMT not meeting the target, because again, our greenhouse gas emission targets, they're aspirational. They're set for, what would you need to get there? So we want to make sure that that would be tied to the illustrative list to make sure that you have enough at your capacity to show what it would take to get there.
Okay, well, I would like to hear from our regional model people, because I know that they participate in that. And with our Salem process we've been working on, we've been trying to get the model to be responsive, and it's not. Another just quick question or comment is that the way I read this is that all this modeling has to be done based on the existing acknowledged comprehensive plan designations. And that, to me, doesn't allow for the transportation and land use planning to happen together. It basically says you have to get some acknowledged land use designations, which in theory, getting those requires conformance with, Goal 12 and transportation planning rule. But you can't, for you doing your TSP, you have to rely on acknowledged land use designations. And I'm running into that right now with, once again, the R. Salem process. And anyway, not sure how that works.
It's a good point. And we are trying to link it to the climate friendly areas designations as well to make sure that we are accounting for smart land use planning. But the timing would really be essential there.
All right, thanks, Julie. And Sarah, I know we didn't get to your hand before, so maybe let's have you go ahead if you don't mind, and then we'll go to the others with their hands up. Thanks.
Thank you. I just want to say I'm really excited about this VMT reduction work, and I'm enthusiastic to see this develop. The word aspirational alarms me a little bit. Our VMT reduction targets shouldn't be aspirational. They should be what we're actually trying to achieve. I think we're talking here about a wholesale transformation in the way we think about the transportation system, and we have to do it really quickly. So we just have to be pushing really, really hard. And I think, I'm hearing a lot of the conversation. It seems like we're framing up things like pedestrian and bicycle and transit infrastructure as kind of extras, things we're adding on, things like adding a protected bike lane to all the streets. And I think I just would like to see us pushing really hard for things that are bigger. Like, how do we remove the cars from one street to make it easier for bikes and peds to walk on that? Instead of thinking about pedestrian and bicycle and transit and GHD reduction as being an extra, it has to be at the core because of all those co-benefits that you talked about too, Cody. So I just really want to underline the urgency with this and the importance of VMT reduction as being really central to achieving these greenhouse gas reduction outcomes. We know that we have to both reduce VMT and electrify the remaining VMT. Like, there's no way we'll achieve our goals without that. So this has to be, I just encourage you to push as hard as possible on this in particular. I think just for example, like the pedestrian range, like if pedestrians have to cross 16 arterials, do we want to shrink the range of pedestrians? Or do we want to make it a lot easier to cross those arterials? So I'd like us to be thinking about how do we make it a lot easier to cross those arterials instead of how do we shrink our goals in order to accommodate the existing landscape that prioritizes vehicle movement over people movement. So that was my manifesto on VMT reduction. Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Sarah. And Emma?
Thank you. I'd like to actually ask Paul Thompson, my alternate, since he is more intimately engaged in the modeling. We have some specific kind of questions and concerns around that. So Paul, are you there? Maybe unmuting. We're still not hearing you if you're speaking.
There we go.
There we go.
I was
Yeah.
double muted, sorry.
I was double muted. Okay, so I have been reading through this pretty extensively, and yesterday I spent an hour meeting with 2 members of the Oregon Modeling Steering Committee, and a couple of hours talking with Springfield staff and Emma about all of these things. But I'm going to just rattle off some questions and concerns we have around this VMT section. This has already been mentioned. We don't think that the models are sensitive to individual project changes or sensitive to some of the types of projects that will be included in these plans, so that's concerning to us. It was mentioned yesterday by one of the other modelers that the models throughout the state are not uniform. And so one set of conditions and projects may be modeled differently regarding VMT outcome in one location or under one model than under another model in another part of the state. So that seems to be a concern. Models require pretty detailed information on projects. And if you're modeling the entire illustrative list, you're needing a lot of information on those projects, not just concepts for corridors, but information about turn lanes and signalization and transit priority at every intersection along a corridor that may be a project on a list. It's a lot of work, and that's concerning. It was mentioned yesterday that if we are modeling under a given set of assumptions around fleet, fuels, and all the other things that will be set assumptions, and any of those assumptions change, say 5 years from now, the fuels assumption drastically changes. Do we have to remodel all of our VMT? And what happens if that results in a bad outcome for us, or a less good, less VMT reduction outcome? Couple more quick things. We were wondering if we could use what sort of came up yesterday as a hybrid approach to estimating and demonstrating the VMT impacts. In other words, not just the model, but also some off-model assumptions that we can demonstrate or somehow back up. You know, for instance, the transportation options plan is part of this, and it's hard to model transportation options activities. It's hard to model the effects of education and incentives and things like that, other than just changing the mode split or the mode share assumptions in the model. But we think there are off-model ways that we'd like to be able to use to reach a VMT calculation. We wondered about the maximum 20-year horizon. RTPs, the federal RTPs, have a 24 or 25-year horizon, and you actually place a maximum 20-year horizon on the TSPs and say that they will inform the RTPs. We think there's a disconnect there. We also have a real, especially as an NPO, I have real heartburn around Rule 160, talking about the regional transportation plan being the regional way to do this. There's really no way that we want the federal plan tied to this or these state rules met through the federal actions. We have real heartburn around that. I'll stop there.
All right, thank you.
If I just respond to one thing there, I just want to clarify that I'm hoping it came through, but in section 4, subsection B, we are, hoping to tie in policies, and we're not being prescriptive as far as like how you would demonstrate that. So, in respect to all the modelers out there, and if it's the choice of an off model or something else, but getting to our goals, and Portland has brought this up continuously, you can't build your way out. There's no way, there's no money, but the policies are a lot more bang for the buck. And we want to make sure that if we're asking for TDM or TO policies, that those would be, you could use those as well. And so hopefully if the model sensitive, great. If off modeling is the way to go, I think we're more agnostic as the way to go there.
Thanks, Cody. And Mary Kyle.
This again is going into the timing of things as you go forward and try to figure out how you're going to explain that to the commission and to us. If I understood this correctly, for those that opt for the regional approach, the TSP that they would need to revise to conform to these rules would not be until the TSP after their next RTP. timed to the RTP. So it would happen after the next RTP. And that, I think, brings us to 2027, 2028, until those TSPs, if you follow the regional approach, would be updated to conform to these rules. Don't know if I was following all those dots correctly, but if so, that's really late. And again, it just highlights the need for all of us to have some sort of a master time schedule here. Thanks.
Thanks, Marika. And Al.
Thank you. So my question has to do, I think, with the second filter, the filter about whether or not projects will move the needle toward VMT and how much they'll do that. And there are some references, which I don't remember exactly, to assumptions and that kind of thing. And this really has to do with the kind of certainty or probability or reliability you're looking for in your modeling, your off modeling, whatever you're doing. How do you determine how much to credit or debit a given project when you're applying that filter? And assuming that a project shows that it's going to have a modest impact, good impact on downward impact on VMT, does it go on the list automatically? And if it shows it has a modest negative impact on VMT, is it automatically off the list?
So it was very important that we didn't want to get into a project by project demonstration of VMT. So this rule proposes that as a whole, the project list financially constrained would demonstrate an overall reduction and not to increase VMT, and that the illustrative list as a whole, when they're all summed together, because once you get into project by project, then you're really, talking about a lot of details, a lot of variables that maybe haven't been thought out. You're just kind of scoping. So it is really trying to allow more flexibility for saying, we know there's going to be instances where you need to add some capacity or you need to do some work on the road network to, serve the cars. But, as a whole, we need to be headed in the right direction here. And that's the reason that we're not talking on the project by project level.
And so I guess what I'm thinking about is the CAFE standards where, Toyota sells a whole lot of Priuses, and the more Priuses it sells, the more giant Toyota gas guzzlers it can sell. It gets a free chit to sell a big pickup truck for every Prius it sells. So you have that trade-off problem you get, where you can end up very close to just a barely positive, and you've built a lot of big projects.
Great point.
Thanks, Al. And Paige.
Paige West with Rogue Valley Transit. Wanted to echo what Paul was describing with some of the deficiencies that we have with our current travel demand modeling around the state, and our experience here at Rogue Valley Transit with being able to utilize those models to input the transit system network out to 2040 and showing a very, very, we quadrupled our transit system from today out to 2040. And it showed just about a 5% increase in transit use, which I don't feel is reflective of what we would actually see if we truly did quadruple our transit system. So that's just one example. But I also wanted to bring up the household travel demand survey or travel activity survey. Anyway, those of you who know what that is know what I'm trying to say, which is supposed to happen every 10 years. And we just finished one recently. And I think a lot of the MPOs stressed the point to ODOT how important it is to have that data, and it's very costly, and being able to commit to having the state pay for those types of activities so that we can gather this data over time, and adjust the models so that they're more accurate to the changes that we're seeing over time. This last round of household travel surveys, fortunately, came out of the local MPO's budgets. And so that decreased the funds that we had for our actual projects that we're talking about. And I think many of us were more wanting ODOT to commit to doing that through the STIP cycles so that we know it can be relied upon and does not conflict with the local funding being dedicated to these projects.
All right, thank you, Paige. All right, any other questions or comments on the VMT topic?
No, sorry, I didn't find my hand soon enough. This is Margie. Sorry, just I appreciate all the comments of my colleagues, especially in the other MPOs, and Metro does have a little bit more advanced modeling capabilities. That said, they take staff and resources. We did have to do layoffs this past couple of years in the economic downturn, and we've shrunk down our research capabilities. And I just want to second what Paige said. We took funding from the pot that usually goes to active transportation. So in the last allocation, we call it regional flex funds, but other people know it as also CMAC or STBG funds. We did have to cut from that pie. So we had to cut from the active transportation pie in order to support the household survey and other research. So these activities, so we are working, even though Metro thinks of us as a very big MPO, we are working in a highly financially constrained environment. I know our fellow MPOs are too. And so we need to think about resources to do the proper analysis, knowing, and then being conscious, as Paige was pointing out, of where that comes from and what are the trade-offs when we mandate something to an MPO or to a local partner. Where does that money taken from? It's not new, to Paige's point. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Margie. Okay, well, appreciate all of those questions and thoughts on the VMT reduction targets and the concerns about modeling and kind of financial constraints. It's really important to bring all that up. I think with that, we'll move into our kind of next steps and wrapping up the meeting. And I believe that Chair MacArthur is able to make some closing remarks. Our other two RAC chairs have been unable to stay for the full meeting. So Chair MacArthur, over to you.
Thank you, Sylvia. I appreciate that. And I will close by reflecting on Commissioner Lelak's opening remarks by saying a sincere thank you on behalf of the Commission. I think I can offer that to each and every one of you for your participation in this effort. For the RAC members, I just really enjoy being part of these. I've been able to be a part of a few of them, and I just learned so much. My copious notes from all of what you said are here in writing. And we really couldn't do this effort without the various voices and the robust comments that you make about this. DL City staff, I want to really thank you folks. Strong team, really complicated, ambitious effort. We're connecting, you guys are connecting, we're all trying to connect the dots with housing, equity, transportation, economic development, all these different things. And it's a really worthwhile effort. It's very exciting for me as a commission member. And I look forward to working with you to make this thing happen. And then to the facilitators, to Sylvia and your team, really super job doing that. I think you've all given us a pretty simple charge to get it done quickly and get it done right. Doesn't seem very simple when I think about all the great comments we've had, but I also want to reflect on, there's been a lot of great work done to date. We've laid a lot of great groundwork, and I think people understand what we're trying to accomplish now, and they're engaging in a very specific way. I really appreciate some of the problem solving comments. People identified a problem and then tried to answer it or give a suggestion on how to solve that. That's going to be very helpful to staff as well as the commission going forward. I think we're really well positioned for our September meeting, and I want to thank everybody for your effort and participation in this.
Thanks so much, Chair MacArthur. Really appreciate that. And I'll turn it over to Kevin from DLCD. Any kind of next steps, remarks about upcoming meetings, action items?
Well, I do just have some quick updates. So first of all, and most importantly, following this meeting, we will be sending out a survey as we do, and we are looking for your input using that survey instrument. That should go out right after the meeting. We're going to allow a little more time than we have in the past for comments back. We'll be looking to get those comments back from you on Monday, September 27th. That may not be as long as people are wanting, but we very much need to turn around revisions and get those back for our October 15 meeting. So those packets will be going out on October 8th or possibly sooner than that. So we need time to digest your comments and fold those in. In October, we'll come back to our draft rules for climate-friendly areas. You'll see some revisions to those rules, as well as the parking things that we discussed at our last meeting. And I think the remaining elements of the transportation planning rule, the remaining pieces there. I do want to speak very briefly to one thing I probably should have mentioned at the beginning is we did get a lot of questions about funding, and we've heard that in this meeting today. And so I just want to outline just a few things in terms of what we're working on for supporting implementation, local government implementation of these rules. So as you are likely aware, we're looking to connect funding and programs to climate plans and performance measures. We're actively working with the governor's office and other state agencies to provide state support for implementation through that interagency technical support team. That group is continuing to meet, and we're hoping to leverage funding from other state agencies to support our work as well. I'm happy to report that the recent legislative session resulted in funding for a limited duration position at DLCD to support local government implementation. So that will be through this biennium, as well as $768,000 to support local government implementation of these rules. So we do have, it's not a huge amount, but we do have some dedicated funding to support local government implementation. We've also, as you know, been in conversation with ODOT, and ODOT has set aside money in their budget to support scenario planning and transportation system plans to support this work. And as many of you know, the Transportation Growth Management Program will continue to provide some level of support for these rules once they're adopted and the work that local governments will do. It won't be exclusively dedicated to that work, but it will continue to be a source of funding to support local government work, assuming that future legislative sessions will continue to allocate funding for that. So I think that's it for me. I just want to say again, thank you so much for your engagement today. Wow, we got so many smart people in this group, and I just appreciate everyone's thinking. We got a lot of stuff to think about. Looking forward to seeing you back in October. So thanks.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, and thanks, RAC members, again, for your time and efforts and thinking through all of this. We will see you all at the next meeting and enjoy your afternoon. Take care.
Thank you.